I just want to touch base about a story going around about a golden-hoofed goat idol at Mar-a-Lago, and here's the image that some of us have already seen. Since a couple of people asked about this, I thought I'd chime in and give my thoughts on this. Once I saw it, I was taken aback for a second or two, but then it kind of struck me as not quite a realistic image, and let me tell you why. First, I'll show a couple of other images of this goat supposedly being at Mar-a-Lago. Here's one, a little bit of a side view, and here's a close-up also. But getting back to the original image, what struck me first was at the front of Mr. Goat, there's a sign that says, "I love you," signed by Donald Trump. And the odd part of that is the signature of Trump is not centered. And it's these kind of little inconsistencies that usually give away either a photoshopped or AI type of image. And the woman in this picture, I think, may very well have been at Mar-a-Lago, but standing in front of something else. And this image of a goat was kind of photoshopped in and around her. And also the background behind the goat doesn't quite ring true. It just looks a little bit artificial, and you'll see what I mean once I zoom in a little bit. As we can see here, it's clearly not a legitimate picture. Although I should add that the differences between real pictures and AI and Photoshop are just getting harder and harder to tell apart anymore. So it is possible that I might be over-exaggerating that background as not looking real, but that is my gut instinct. The other image I was showing a moment ago from the side looks a little more real as far as the goat goes, although there are also things that bother me in this image, such as why it would be hanging off the edge of the table. And the reason I say that is we can approximate how big this would be just by the number of fake Trump dollar bills on this image, which appears to be about 5.5 to 6 rows across and approximately 14 rows high. And if you take the size of one of these fake Trump bills, which I believe are about the size of a legitimate dollar bill, which is a little over 6 inches in length and a little over 2.5 inches wide, but assuming they're about the size of a legitimate dollar bill, this puts the image of the goat at approximately 3 feet at its base and maybe 3.5 feet tall. Now that sounds a little small for a table, at least why part of it should be leaning off the edge. But it is possible, I think, that this was something created by a Trump supporter, because as we know, some of them are very much into creating artworks that glorify Donald Trump. So all in all, I think this was something that was created by a hardcore Trump supporter, but it probably was not actually at Mar-a-Lago. I'm just struck by how fake the background looks. And also, before I forget, this image was only on Reddit and Blue Sky for a while, and then the Midas Touch network picked up a short story about it earlier today. So I didn't see any identification of this woman who was supposedly posing with this statue or any other images of this, which reminds me of what happened last year with the Ark of the Covenant image. There were 2 images, one of James O'Keefe, another of Laura Loomer, but that's all we saw, and there was a lot of discussion as to whether this was actually real, but we also had similar type of problems with that image as we do with this goat. For instance, looking at this image of James O'Keefe with the Ark of the Covenant, you can tell that the Ark, or Ark replica, or whatever it is not even centered on the table. It is almost falling off the back edge. And we also have a bit of a manipulation, for example, in James O'Keefe himself. If you look at the upper half of his body, which is much, much larger, and then the lower half of his body is more normal. So there is kind of a distortion of this image, with the other image also showing the same kind of weird off-centered location of the Ark of the Covenant compared to the table. And this image, the so-called Ark of the Covenant, also has a very unusual glow to it compared to the ambient lighting. But once again, we could have had a situation where James O'Keefe and Laura Loomer were standing next to something, but then someone photoshopped an image of this supposed replica of the Ark of the Covenant. A good comparison was the Ark of the Covenant replica that was on display in Israel this past summer, and there are several different pictures and different angles of it, which makes it easier to tell this was a legitimate replica of the Ark. Just looking at this more up close, you can tell how it was centered properly on the table. You can actually see where the feet of the Ark make contact with the tabletop, as opposed to looking at these other images at the Mar-a-Lago, where they almost merge into nothingness because there's no contact being made. It's just being photoshopped on top. So that's my thoughts. Getting back to this, I tend to think this is not a real image. It doesn't strike me as being a real image. It's possible that the goat itself was actually made something along the lines of maybe being 2.5, 3 feet by 3 feet, something like this, not giant. But I'll keep my mind open on this in case more information comes out. But I haven't seen any legitimate news sources on this. It was kind of like Reddit was linking to Blue Sky, which linked to Reddit. Then you toss in the Midas Network story, and it was kind of like a circular sourcing for the story. Now, I do think this kind of stuff is interesting, but we do need to keep our critical mind going when we see stories like this, not just automatically assume that it's reality when it might be conjured up out of thin air, especially nowadays because it's just so easy to fake anything, unfortunately. But I'll be back this week with a couple of longer videos. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and I will talk to you guys soon.